Hey everybody. In this lecture, we're going to start talking about material from the book you're reading, Karen Haltutin's Confidence Men and Painted Women. All the lectures last week were built around getting you to understand the context of this book, the tremendous changes going on, transforming 19th century America, Victorianism and the values and beliefs that went into that ideology. And now we're going to start getting into the content of the book itself. Okay. Now, the title of the book begins Confidence Men. So, first thing we got to talk about here is okay, well, what was a confidence man? You know what a confidence man is, but you know it by the abbreviated term for this kind of person. A confidence man is a con man. That's what her book is about con men. During the middle of the 19th century, during the middle of this Victorian period that we've been learning about, there was a tremendous fear, almost an irrational fear, of con men, and a fear that there was a growing number of con men increasingly preying upon people in Victorian society. And what Haltunen is interested in the book was about, well, what was going on? Because in statistical terms, there was no actual increase in con men in Victorian society. As long as there has been civilization, there have been con men. Okay, there are con men today. But for some reason in the Victorian era, particularly this period from the 1830s to the 1860s, there was almost an irrational fear and a preoccupation with con men that wasn't based on any sort of statistical reality. And this is what Haltunen's interested in. And what she believes is going on and what the book is about is that there was fear of political change, economic change, social change that was going on in America between the 1630s and the 1660s. And that the Victorians couldn't really understand or altogether grapple with these political and economic and societal changes. And so what they did is they kind of projected their fears about this change into the archetype of the con man. That the con man came to represent their fear of change. All right? And that's what we're going to be talking about. That these big changes, economic changes, political changes, social changes, got manifested into a fear about con men, what she calls confidence men. Let's now talk about, well, why do they call them confidence men? What's that about? Well, that's because confidence is the essential element of the con. See, a confidence man, a con man, is not a robber. He or she is not a thief. They do not come up behind you in the street and hit you over the head with a brick and steal your wallet while you're laying in the ground in a pool of blood. No. That's not how con men roll. A con man greets you and says hello, and you say hello back, and you exchange pleasantries. And the con man you think is your friend, and the con man asks you to take out your wallet, and you do it because the con man is your friend, and the con man asks you to open your wallet, and you do because the con man is your friend, and then the con man asks you to take out some money and give it to him, and you do because he's your friend and you trust him. You have confidence in the con man. And then he takes your money, and you smile, and you exchange more pleasantries, and then you say goodbye and say, I'll see you next time. That's how a con works. You're not threatened at gunpoint. You develop some sort of undue confidence in this person. You come to believe that person is your friend, and you willfully hand them the money. You willfully send them money through PayPal. You willfully write them a check, and then they rip you off because you mistakenly had confidence in them. That's the way cons work. That's why con men are called confidence men. They develop a confidence in their prey, in their mark, and then they swindle them. All right? There was a growing fear of confidence men in the middle 1800s, and that's what Hal Tunan's really interested in. What's going on with this? Why was there so much fear about this? All right. Now, to understand where this fear is coming from, Tunan feels like you need to go back to the American Revolution and the establishment of the nation and some of the ideas behind the founding of the nation. And in the beginning of the book, she talks about this idea of Republican ideology. The founding fathers were deeply influenced, not simply by the Enlightenment thought we talked about in our second unit, but also what historians call Republican ideology or radical Whiggism, that really goes back to European Renaissance thought. Okay, now, real important, do not confuse this Republican ideology I'm talking about and Hal Tunan is talking about in her book with the contemporary Republican Party. That could easily be confusing. Today, when we talk about Republican ideology, we're talking about the contemporary Republican Party and their belief and their political ideas. This has nothing to do with the contemporary Republican Party. We're talking about ideas going back to the European Renaissance that deeply influenced the founding fathers, that don't have anything to do with contemporary Republican politics. So don't get confused by that. Okay. Now, certain Renaissance thinkers developed ideas about, how to govern a state. What would an ideal country be governed as? And one of the ideas that they came to believe is that liberty, what we've already talked about, freedom, liberty, was the most precious and best thing a society could have. The best governed countries have freedom. But the problem with freedom, liberty, is that liberty is by its nature very weak and very vulnerable and easily overcome. It's precious, it's wonderful, but it's just not that robust. You could almost think of the way some Renaissance thinkers thought about liberty as kind of like a beautiful orchid. Beautiful, but also delicate and vulnerable. It gets too hot, that orchid dies. It gets too cold, that orchid dies. You give it too much water, it's going to die. You don't give it enough water, it's going to die. If it's not the right kind of soil, it's not going to grow. It's beautiful, but it's vulnerable. And that's the way these Renaissance thinkers that developed this idea of Republican ideology thought. Liberty is wonderful. It's the best thing a state can have. But it's weak and it's vulnerable. And in particular, the thing it is most vulnerable to is power. Power seeks to destroy liberty. The enemy of liberty is the concentration of power. Think of this in the most simplistic terms. Just think of it how dictators govern their state. Dictators accumulate power and deny freedom to their citizens. How can they deny that freedom to their citizens? Because they have the power. They control the police. They control the secret police. They control the army. And through their use of power, they can suppress the liberty of their citizens. So this Republican ideology held that the greatest thing a society could have is liberty. But liberty is weak and vulnerable. And in particular, liberty is vulnerable to power. That power always seeks to deny the liberty of citizens. So the founding fathers, very much influenced by those Enlightenment ideas we talked about before, and also this Republican ideology, wanted to create a United States that had liberty, because what they had learned from Republican ideology is that liberty is the greatest thing a society could have. But they also came to be very worried that this liberty is often weak and vulnerable. And in particular, it's vulnerable to the encroachment of power. And so what did the founding fathers do? They tried to create a system of government that diffused that diffused power. You know, we all studied this in our government classes in high school, and some of you are continuing to study this in university. They created a system of government with 3 different layers of government that each had their own checks and balances over other areas of government. You had the executive branch, you had the legislative branch, and you had the judicial branch. And they all contained a certain amount of power, but not a monopoly on power. And some of their power was to check and reduce the power of other branches of government. The president has some power over the legislature and the judicial. The judicial has some power over the executive and the legislature, and it goes like that. You were going to have power. You needed power to run a state. But the founding fathers worked very hard to try and diffuse this power, spread it out so power could not be monopolized and prey upon liberty. And the hope was, if we diffuse this power, if we create checks and balances to limit the possibility of the monopolization of this power, liberty could persist. We could have a society filled with liberty. But simply dividing government, creating checks and balances, was not going to be enough. What the founding fathers did was they tried to create a system of government that had really unprecedented amounts of power given to the people themselves. The people were going to be able to elect at least some of their leaders. And one of the things that the founding fathers were worried about was what would happen to our society if the people themselves lose their virtue. Okay? If we're going to have a system of government in which we allow the people themselves to make decisions, we let them vote, we let them elect their representatives, then the people themselves need to be virtuous and smart and make good decisions. You can try and create mechanisms to diffuse political power, but if ultimately the people themselves lose their virtue and start electing the wrong kind of people, everything's gonna go to hell. When the founding fathers, after they won the revolution, thought about, well, how did we win? How did this ragtag little band of colonies defeat this great empire of Great Britain? They often told themselves, well, we did it through our virtue. We did it because we are virtuous and determined and hardworking. And the British, particularly the personification through the King George III of England, those English have grown lazy and decadent and corrupt and soft. That's why those people lost, and that's why we won. Think of a nation of Benjamin Franklins, right? That's how the founding fathers saw themselves. You know, we're like Ben Franklin. They're like a corrupt, decadent, lazy king. And that's why we won. Okay. We also had a lot of help from the French and their navy and their money and their troops. We tend not to talk about that in American history. We were very dependent on the French. But from the very beginning of the United States, the Americans saw their virtue as a key aspect of their success. Why are we successful? It is our hardworking nature. It is our disinclination to make bad decisions. We're not lazy. We're hardworking. We are virtuous. But one of the things that the founding fathers and then later generations constantly worried about was the possibility of future generations losing their virtue, becoming decadent and lazy and corrupt and soft, just like what they believed had happened to the English. So worrying about that next generation is a really old part of American character. Okay, that's not to say the Americans are the only people that worry about the younger generation and things going wrong with the younger generation. They're not. Every society has this fear. People get old, they get scared of the kids, they forget what it was like themselves to be young, and they judge the younger generation harshly and think that they're dumb and they're lazy and their music sucks. And worry about the kids and think the kids are going to be the destruction of the nation. Okay, lots of countries have this mentality and worry about the youth, but the Americans do it more than anybody else. We are obsessed with worrying about the younger generation. Okay, for you Zoomers, you know, if you feel attacked by the olds, look, there's nothing new about that. Okay, you know, when I was young, the olds worried that my generation was going to be the end of America. When those people were old, when the boomers were young, the olds worried about these kids are going to be the end of America. There's been this constant refrain that somehow these kids are going to mess it up and it's going to be the destruction of America. This is where we start getting back to thinking about confidence men. Okay? To understand the fear of confidence men in the middle of the 1800s, you have to understand that this fear of Americans losing their virtue was a significant fear. This was a concern. And there was a worry that this next generation is going to be the generation that loses its virtue and will be the end of the United States as we know it. All right. So let's talk a bit about, like, okay, well, how would that actually work? Can we get into some more specifics about how they're fearful about losing virtue in the next generation? The threat of the confidence man was not simply a fear that people are going to get their property ripped off, people are going to lose money, or people are going to be swindled and sign over the deed to their house or lose their business because of a con man. It was more than that. There was a deeper fear. There was a fear that in interacting with con men, that you yourself somehow will get infected, almost like a disease, that it will corrupt you, that your interaction with the con man will lead you to also being a con man yourself. Sort of like, hey, I just got swindled by a con man. Hey, maybe I need to be a con man too if I'm going to survive in this world. And there was a kind of fear that there was an exponential threat to the con man. Theoretically, you start out with one con man, and then con man cons somebody else. And then the second person gets infected, and now they become a con man too. And then those two now infect two more people. And now you got four, right? And then you got those four turn into 8, and I don't have enough fingers anymore. 16, 32. That the threat of the con man was a kind of like a disease that exponentially infects. And at some point, the virtue of the Americans will be gone. That it won't be there anymore. And again, I will remind you, this wasn't actually happening. There actually was no societal increase in con men. That's really important to acknowledge. Con men weren't new to the middle 1800s. Okay. And there wasn't really any sort of threat of infection with con men. What we're talking about is societal fear. And often societal fear is irrational. Okay? Every time my family goes to the beach and we swim in the ocean, my wife is afraid we're going to get eaten by sharks. It's not a rational fear. And we joke about this in the family. And she knows it's not a rational fear, but she still worries when we go in the water that we're going to get eaten by sharks. Right? The chances of actually getting harmed by sharks is statistically infinitesimal. The really dangerous thing about going to the beach is getting in your car and driving to the beach. That's the riskiest thing you will do on the way there. Or getting trapped in a riptide and drowning, but getting eaten by a shark. That's not a real statistical fear. Okay. But nonetheless, lots of people worry about it. Lots of people worry about sharks. So societal fears are not always rational. In fact, a lot of times in societies, we worry about all the wrong things and don't really consider the things we should be fearful of. So this actual fear of confidence men was not a rational thing. But nonetheless, they worried about it. And they worried about the possibility of people not only getting conned, swindled by con men, but also that this interaction with con men was going to infect the victim, and they would also become a con, and they would lose their virtue. And as this continued on, American virtue would decline. And without virtue, how can a society based on vesting power into the hands of the people continue? Liberty is weak. Freedom is vulnerable. And if we don't maintain our virtue, we can't maintain our society. That was the fear. Okay. Now, in the next lecture, we're going to talk about the specifics of the con men. Haltunen in your book categorizes 3 different types of con men. They were all con men, but what they were after and how they swindled people was different. And what Haltunen argues in the book is that each one of these 3 con men represented a different kind of fear. One represented fear of social change. One represented fear of economic change, and one represented fear of political change. Right? And so in our next lecture, we'll pick up on that and we'll talk about these different kinds of con men and explain the ideas the Victorians had about how the con actually worked. Okay, that's enough for this lecture. I'll see you guys next time.